The letter that changed my life arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped through the mail slot of my tiny apartment by a postal worker who had no idea she was delivering an earthquake. I almost threw it away without opening it, assuming it was another piece of junk mail, the kind that promised me I had won a sweepstakes I had never entered or been pre-approved for a credit card I didn't want. But something about this envelope made me pause. It was heavy, the paper thick and cream-colored, expensive in a way that junk mail never was. The return address was embossed in gold lettering, a law firm with a name that sounded like it belonged in a novel about old money and older secrets. Whitmore, Sterling, and Chase. I had never heard of them, had never done business with them, had no reason to believe they even knew I existed. And yet, here was a letter addressed to me, Ms. Elena Marchetti, at my tiny apartment on the south side of the city, the apartment with the leaking faucet and the neighbor who played loud music at 3 in the morning and the view of a brick wall that I had been staring at for 6 years. I opened the envelope standing in my kitchen, still wearing my bathrobe, my hair still wet from the shower, my coffee growing cold on the counter beside me. The letter inside was brief, just a few paragraphs of formal, legal language that took me 3 readings to fully understand. The essence of it was this. A man named Arthur Blackwell had passed away 3 weeks ago at the age of 87, and in his last will and testament, he had bequeathed to me a property. Not money, not stocks or bonds or valuable jewelry. A house, a specific house, located at 47 Blackthorn Lane in the town of Millbrook, about 3 hours north of the city. The letter did not explain who Arthur Blackwell was or why he had left me anything. It simply stated the facts, informed me that I was the sole beneficiary of this particular bequest, and requested that I contact the law firm at my earliest convenience to begin the process of transferring the deed into my name. I read the letter 4 times, standing in my kitchen with my cold coffee and my wet hair, and my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. Arthur Blackwell. The name meant nothing to me. I had never met him, never spoken to him, never even heard of him. I had no connection to the town of Millbrook, had never been there, couldn't have found it on a map if my life depended on it. I had no wealthy relatives, no family connections to old money, no reason for a complete stranger to leave me a house. It made no sense. It was absurd. It was the kind of thing that happened in novels and movies, not in the life of a 32-year-old waitress who lived in a rundown apartment and had exactly $742 in her savings account. My first instinct was to call the law firm and tell them there had been a mistake. Clearly, the letter was meant for someone else. Another Elena Marchetti, perhaps a more successful one, a more deserving one who had actually known Arthur Blackwell and had done something to earn his gratitude. But when I called the number on the letterhead, my voice shaking slightly as I explained the situation to the receptionist, I was transferred to a senior partner, a man with a voice like polished mahogany and the measured, deliberate manner of someone who had been practicing law for longer than I had been alive. His name was Mr. Whitmore, and he assured me, with the calm certainty of someone who had checked and double-checked every detail, that there was no mistake. "Ms. Marchetti," he said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "I understand that this must come as a surprise. But Mr. Blackwell was very specific in his instructions. The property at 47 Blackthorn Lane is yours, free and clear, with no encumbrances or conditions. He was of sound mind when he made this bequest, and he was adamant that it go to you and no one else." "But why?" I asked, the question that had been burning in my mind since the moment I opened the letter. "I never met him. I don't know who he is. Why would he leave me a house?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that suggested Mr. Whitmore was choosing his next words very carefully. "Mr. Blackwell did not share his reasons with me," he said finally. "He simply instructed me to ensure that the property was transferred to you upon his death. However, he did leave a letter for you, to be delivered along with the deed. Perhaps that letter will provide the answers you're looking for." A letter. Arthur Blackwell had left me a letter. The thought sent a strange shiver down my spine, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, and something else I couldn't quite name. "Can you send it to me?" I asked. "The letter, I mean." I'd like to read it as soon as possible." "Of course," Mr. Whitmore said. "I'll have it couriered to you this afternoon." And Ms. Marchetti, if I may say so, Mr. Blackwell was a very thoughtful man. He didn't do anything without a reason. Whatever that reason was, I'm sure it will become clear to you in time. The courier arrived 3 hours later, a young man in a blue uniform who handed me a thick envelope and asked me to sign for it. I took it upstairs to my apartment, closed the door behind me, and sat down on my second-hand couch with the envelope in my hands. My name was written on the front in handwriting that was old-fashioned and elegant, the kind of cursive they used to teach in schools 100 years ago. The letters were slightly shaky, as if they had been written by a hand that was no longer as steady as it once was. But they were still beautiful, still deliberate, still full of a dignity that seemed to belong to another era. I opened the envelope carefully, not wanting to tear the paper, and pulled out a sheaf of pages covered in that same elegant handwriting. The letter was dated 6 months before Arthur Blackwell's death, and it began with a salutation that made my breath catch in my throat. "My dear Elena," it read, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and my final wishes have been carried out. I hope you will forgive an old man for reaching out to you in this way, through lawyers and legal documents and the cold formalities of a last will and testament. I would have preferred to speak to you in person, to explain everything face to face, to answer your questions and ease your confusion. But I was a coward, and I let the years slip away, and now I am out of time. So I must do my best with what I have left, which is this letter, in the hope that you will understand." I turned the page, my hands trembling, my heart pounding. Who was this man, and why was he writing to me as if he knew me, as if we had some kind of connection that I had never been aware of? "Your mother, Claire, was the love of my life." The letter continued, and I felt the world tilt around me. "We met when we were both very young, before she met your father, before she moved away and started a new life and left me behind. We were engaged to be married, in fact. I had bought the house at 47 Blackthorn Lane for us, a beautiful old Victorian with a garden and a white picket fence and a nursery that I hoped we would fill with children. It was my dream, our dream, and for a brief, shining moment, I believed it would come true. But it was not to be. Your mother fell in love with someone else, a man named Anthony Marchetti, and she broke off our engagement 6 weeks before the wedding. I was devastated. I was angry. I said things I shouldn't have said, did things I shouldn't have done. And your mother left, and she married Anthony, and she had you, and I never saw her again. My mother. He had known my mother. He had loved my mother. He had been engaged to her, had bought a house for her, had planned a life with her. And then she had left him for my father, and he had spent the rest of his life alone. The realization hit me like a wave, knocking the air from my lungs, making the room spin around me. I never stopped loving her. The letter continued, and I could hear the pain in those words, the decades of loneliness and regret that were compressed into that single sentence. I tried to move on. I tried to find someone else. But no one ever measured up to Claire. No one ever made me feel the way she made me feel. And so I lived alone in the house I had bought for her, surrounded by the ghosts of the life we might have had together. I told myself I was content. I told myself I had made peace with the past. But the truth is, I was waiting. Waiting for something I couldn't name, something I couldn't define, something that never came. I was crying now, tears streaming down my face and falling onto the pages of the letter, blurring the elegant handwriting in places. My mother had died 5 years ago, taken by a sudden stroke that had given no warning and offered no chance to say goodbye. She had never mentioned Arthur Blackwell. She had never told me about the man she had almost married, the man who had loved her his entire life, the man who had lived alone in a house that was meant for her. Why hadn't she told me? Why had she kept this secret from me? "I followed your life from a distance," the letter went on. "I knew it was foolish, perhaps even obsessive, but I couldn't help myself. I read about your birth in the newspaper, a small announcement in the local section. I read about your mother's death 5 years ago, and I wept for days. I read about your struggles, the way you worked your way through school, the way you supported yourself through college, The way you built a life for yourself despite having so little to build with. I was proud of you, Elena, even though I had no right to be. You were the daughter of the woman I loved, and in some strange, indefinable way, I felt a connection to you that I couldn't explain. The letter went on to describe the house in detail, the house that he had bought for my mother all those years ago. It was a Queen and Victorian, he said, with a turret and a wraparound porch and a garden that had once been beautiful but had fallen into neglect in recent years. He had lived there alone for more than 50 years, maintaining it as best he could, filling it with books and art and the accumulated treasures of a long and solitary life. And now he was leaving it to me, the daughter of the woman he had loved, in the hope that I would find some happiness there, that I would restore it, perhaps, that I would fill it with life and love and the things he had never been able to have. I know this must seem strange to you, the letter concluded. A house from a stranger, a gift from a man you never met. But I hope you will accept it in the spirit in which it is given. I hope you will go to Blackthorn Lane and walk through the rooms and see the potential that I saw when I first bought it, all those years ago. And I hope, when you are there, that you will think of your mother and of me, and of the love that might have been but never was. With all my affection, Arthur Blackwell. I set the letter down on the coffee table, my hands still trembling, my cheeks still wet with tears. The apartment was silent around me, the only sound the distant hum of traffic on the street below and the occasional drip of the leaking faucet in the kitchen. I felt like I had been picked up by a tornado and deposited in a completely different life, a life where my mother had secrets and a stranger had loved me from afar, and a house was waiting for me in a town I had never visited. I called my best friend Sarah that evening, reading her the letter over the phone, my voice still shaky and uneven. Sarah listened in silence, and when I finished, she let out a long, slow breath. "That is the most romantic and saddest thing I have ever heard," she said. "This man loved your mother his entire life, and he never got over her. And now he's leaving you his house. It's like something out of a novel." "It's insane," I said, but even as I said it, I knew it wasn't insane. It was strange and unexpected and overwhelming, but it wasn't insane. It was, in its own peculiar way, perfectly logical. Arthur Blackwell had loved my mother. He had bought a house for her. She had left him, and he had kept the house, and now he was giving it to her daughter. It was a gesture of love, a final, posthumous declaration of a feeling that had endured for more than half a century. "You have to go see it," Sarah said firmly. "You can't just ignore this. You have to go to this town, see this house, find out everything you can about Arthur Blackwell and his connection to your mother. This is your history, Elena. This is part of who you are." I knew she was right. I had to go. I had to see the house, walk through its rooms, feel the presence of the man who had lived there alone for 50 years. I had to learn more about my mother's past, about the life she had lived before she met my father, about the love she had left behind. I had to understand why she had never told me about Arthur Blackwell, why she had kept this secret from me for her entire life. The next morning, I packed a small bag, got in my car, and started driving north. The city faded behind me, the crowded streets and towering buildings giving way to suburbs, and then to farmland, and then to the rolling, forested hills of the countryside. The GPS directed me onto increasingly narrow roads, winding through small towns and past old farmhouses and along the edges of lakes that glittered in the autumn sunshine. It was a beautiful drive, the kind of drive that would have been relaxing under any other circumstances. But my mind was too full of questions to relax. Who was Arthur Blackwell, really? What had he been like as a young man, in love and full of hope? What had he been like as an old man, living alone in a house meant for a family that never came? And what did he expect me to do with his house now that it was mine? The town of Millbrook was exactly what I had expected. A small, picturesque village nestled in a valley between two wooded hills, with a main street lined with brick buildings and antique shops, and a single traffic light that blinked yellow in the afternoon sun. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else, where the same families had lived for generations, where strangers were noticed and remembered. I parked my car in front of a cafe called the Millbrook Diner and went inside to ask for directions to Blackthorn Lane. The woman behind the counter was in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a bun and a name tag that read Marge. When I told her I was looking for 47 Blackthorn Lane, her expression shifted, a flicker of something that might have been curiosity or might have been concern. "That's the old Blackwell place," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Are you a relative? I heard someone inherited the house, but nobody around here knew who it was." "I'm not a relative," I said. It's complicated. I'm just trying to understand why he left it to me." Marge studied my face for a moment, her eyes sharp and assessing. Then she nodded slowly, as if she had figured something out. "You must be Claire's daughter," she said. "You have her eyes. The same shape, the same color. I'd recognize them anywhere. I knew your mother, you know. We went to school together before she moved away." I felt my heart skip a beat. "You knew my mother? You knew Arthur Blackwell too?" Marge nodded, her expression softening into something that looked almost like nostalgia. "Everyone around here knew Arthur. He was a good man. Quiet, kept to himself mostly, but good. He never married, you know. Never even dated, as far as anyone could tell. There were rumors, of course. People said he'd had his heart broken when he was young and never got over it. I guess they were right." She paused, her eyes searching my face. "He left you the house, then? That old Victorian on Blackthorn Lane?" "Yes," I said. "I just found out yesterday. I don't know anything about it, or about him, really. I just got a letter from his lawyer and a letter from him, and I thought I should come see it for myself." Marge reached under the counter and pulled out a set of keys. "These are for you, then. Arthur gave them to me about a year ago. He said someone would come looking for them eventually. He said I'd know her when I saw her." She pressed the keys into my hand, her grip warm and firm. He was a strange old man, Arthur Blackwell, but he had a good heart. Whatever his reasons were for leaving you that house, I'm sure they were good ones. The house was at the end of a long, tree-lined driveway, hidden from the road by a thick screen of oaks and maples that were just beginning to turn gold and crimson with the arrival of autumn. I saw the turret first, rising above the trees like something out of a fairy tale, and then the house itself came into view. It was exactly as Arthur had described it in his letter. A Queen and Victorian with a wraparound porch and intricate gingerbread trim, its exterior painted a soft, weathered gray with white accents. The garden was overgrown, the hedges untrimmed and the flower beds choked with weeds, but I could see the bones of what it had once been. A beautiful garden, planted with love and care, now fallen into neglect. I parked my car in the gravel driveway and got out, the keys heavy in my hand. The house loomed above me, its windows dark and empty, its porch sagging slightly in one corner. It looked like it had been waiting for something, or someone. I walked up the porch steps, my footsteps echoing on the weathered wood, and I unlocked the heavy oak front door with a key that felt like it had been waiting for me. The interior of the house was dim and still, the air heavy with the smell of old wood and dust, and something else, something faint and floral that might have been lavender. I stepped into the foyer and looked around, my eyes adjusting slowly to the gloom. To my left, a grand staircase curved upward into the shadows. To my right, a formal living room with furniture draped in white sheets, like ghosts frozen in place. Straight ahead, a hallway led toward the back of the house, where I could see a sliver of light from what must have been the kitchen. I wandered through the rooms in a daze, my footsteps leaving prints in the thick dust that coated the hardwood floors. The living room, the dining room, the library with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with volumes that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. The kitchen, with its vintage appliances and its tiled countertops and its window overlooking the overgrown garden. Every room was frozen in time, preserved exactly as Arthur Blackwell had left it. It was like walking through a museum of a life that had been lived alone. And then I found the photographs. They were in the library, arranged on a small table near the window, as if they had been placed there deliberately for me to find. The first was a photograph of my mother, young and beautiful, her dark hair falling in waves around her shoulders, her smile bright and full of hope. She was standing in front of this very house, her arm linked through the arm of a young man I didn't recognize. He was tall and handsome, with dark hair and kind eyes and a smile that was directed entirely at her. Arthur Blackwell, I realized. This was Arthur Blackwell, the man who had loved my mother, the man who had bought this house for her, the man who had lived here alone for 50 years after she left him. The second photograph was of me. I was maybe 5 years old, sitting on a swing set in a park I didn't recognize, my face split in a gap-toothed grin. I had never seen this photograph before. I didn't know it existed. But Arthur Blackwell had it, had kept it, had placed it on this table next to the photograph of my mother. He had been watching me, just as he had said in his letter, watching from a distance, following my life, caring about me even though we had never met. The third item on the table was a letter. It was addressed to me, in the same elegant handwriting as the letter I had received from Mr. Whitmore. I picked it up with trembling hands and opened it. "My dear Elena," it began. "If you are reading this, then you have come to Blackthorn Lane, and you are standing in the library where I spent so many of my solitary hours. I hope the house does not feel too lonely to you. It was lonely for me for many years, but I always hoped that someday it would be filled with life again. I hope that you will be the one to fill it. I hope you will walk through these rooms and see the potential that I saw when I first bought it. I hope you will restore the garden, repaint the walls, make it your own. And I hope, when you are here, that you will think kindly of an old man who loved your mother and who, in his own strange way, loved you too. With all my affection, Arthur Blackwell." I stood in the library, the letter in my hands, the photographs on the table, and I felt a connection to Arthur Blackwell that was as real and as tangible as anything I had ever felt. He had loved my mother. He had lost her, and he had spent the rest of his life holding on to the memory of what might have been. But in the end, he had reached out to me, a stranger, and given me the most precious thing he had: his home, his sanctuary, his legacy. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of discovery and decision. I took a leave of absence from my job at the diner, packed up my tiny apartment, and moved into the house on Blackthorn Lane. It was not an easy transition. The house needed work, a lot of work, more work than I had anticipated when I first walked through its dusty rooms. The roof leaked in at least 3 places. The plumbing made ominous noises whenever I turned on the taps. The electrical wiring was so old that I was half afraid to plug in anything more powerful than a lamp. But I didn't care. I threw myself into the renovations with an energy I hadn't felt in years, learning how to patch drywall and refinish floors and paint window frames. I hired local contractors for the bigger jobs, and I got to know the people of Millbrook, who welcomed me with the warmth and curiosity of a small town that had been waiting a long time to learn the secrets of the old Blackwell place. I learned more about Arthur Blackwell from the townspeople than I ever could have learned from his letters. Marge at the diner told me stories about him, about how he used to come in for breakfast every morning and sit in the same corner booth and read the newspaper from cover to cover. The librarian, a woman named Helen who had known Arthur for 30 years, showed me the books he had checked out most frequently. Histories, mostly, and biographies, and collections of poetry. He was a romantic, Helen said, her eyes twinkling. He never stopped believing in love. He just never found it again after your mother left. I learned that Arthur had been a successful businessman, the owner of a chain of hardware stores that had made him a modest fortune. He had donated generously to local charities, had funded scholarships for underprivileged students, had paid for the restoration of the town's historic church. He had been well-liked, respected, admired. But he had also been lonely. Deeply, profoundly, irreparably lonely. The kind of lonely that comes from losing the person you love and never finding a way to replace them. And I learned about my mother. Marge told me stories I had never heard, about the girl my mother had been before she met my father. She had been lively and adventurous, always the first to try something new, always the one pushing her friends to take risks and chase their dreams. She had been an artist, a painter, and her work had been displayed in local galleries and admired by everyone who saw it. She had been in love with Arthur Blackwell, truly in love, and everyone in town had expected them to get married and live happily ever after. But then she had met Anthony Marchetti, my father, and everything had changed. She never told me why she left Arthur, Marge said, her voice soft with the weight of old memories. She just came to me one day and said she had met someone else, someone she couldn't live without. I asked her about Arthur, and she just shook her head and said she couldn't explain it. She said it wasn't anything Arthur had done wrong. She just knew, in her heart, that Anthony was the one she was meant to be with. I don't think she ever stopped feeling guilty about it, though. I think she carried that guilt with her for the rest of her life. I thought about my mother, about the woman who had raised me, who had worked 2 jobs to support us after my father died, who had never once mentioned Arthur Blackwell or the house on Blackthorn Lane or the life she had left behind. She had kept this secret from me for my entire life, and now I was beginning to understand why. It wasn't because she was ashamed. It wasn't because she wanted to hide her past from me. It was because the memory of what she had done, the pain she had caused to a man who had loved her, was too heavy to carry and too painful to share. She had buried it deep inside herself, and she had never spoken of it again. As the weeks turned into months, I continued to work on the house, and the house continued to reveal its secrets to me. I found a box of letters in the attic, tied with a faded blue ribbon, love letters that Arthur had written to my mother but never sent. I read every single one, my heart aching for the young man who had poured out his soul onto paper, never knowing that the woman he loved would never read his words. I found a sketchbook in my mother's handwriting, filled with drawings of the house and the garden, drawings she had made when she was young and in love and full of hope for the future. I found a wedding dress in a trunk in the basement, carefully preserved in tissue paper, a dress that had never been worn, a wedding that had never happened. And I found a diary, hidden in a secret compartment in the library, a diary that Arthur had kept for the last year of his life. The entries were brief, sometimes just a sentence or two, but they painted a picture of a man who was coming to terms with his own mortality and trying to find some meaning in the life he had lived. The final entry was dated the day before his death. "I have made my peace," he wrote. "I have lived a long life, longer than I expected, longer than I perhaps deserved. I never stopped loving Claire, and I never will. But I have come to understand that love is not about possession. It is about wanting the best for someone, even if that best is not you. Claire found her happiness with Anthony, and I am grateful for that. And now I have found a way, I hope, to give something to her daughter. The house was meant for a family. It was meant for love and laughter and children. I was never able to give it those things. But perhaps Elena can. Perhaps she will be the one to fill these rooms with life. That is my hope. That is my prayer. That is my final wish." I closed the diary, tears streaming down my face, and I looked around the library, at the bookshelves and the photographs and the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight. This house, this beautiful, neglected, haunted house, was full of ghosts. The ghost of my mother, young and vibrant and full of promise. The ghost of Arthur Blackwell, lonely and heartbroken and impossibly kind. The ghost of a love that had never been fulfilled, a dream that had never come true. But it was also full of possibility, full of potential, full of the future that Arthur had imagined for it, a future that he had entrusted to me. The first spring after I moved into the house, I started working on the garden. It was back-breaking labor, pulling up weeds and tilling soil and planting seeds that I wasn't sure would grow. But I loved it. I loved the feel of the earth in my hands, the smell of the flowers as they began to bloom, the sight of new life emerging from the ground that had been neglected for so long. I planted roses, the same kind of roses that my mother had planted when she lived here, the same kind of roses that Arthur had tended in her memory for 50 years. And when they bloomed, their petals a deep, velvety crimson, I felt a connection to both of them that was almost tangible. They were here with me, in the house, in the garden, in the very air I breathed. They were here, and they always would be. I opened the house to the public that summer, hosting a garden party for the entire town of Millbrook. Marge catered the event, her famous apple pies and homemade lemonade drawing a crowd that filled the wraparound porch and spilled out onto the lawn. Helen brought a display of Arthur's favorite books, which I set up in the library for guests to browse. The mayor gave a speech, thanking me for restoring the old Blackwell place and for becoming part of the community. And I stood on the porch, looking out at the people who had welcomed me into their town and their lives, and I felt a sense of belonging that I had never felt before. The house on Blackthorn Lane was not just a house anymore. It was a home. My home. The home that Arthur Blackwell had bought for my mother and kept for me. The home that had been waiting for me my entire life, even though I hadn't known it existed. And every time I walked through its rooms, every time I tended its garden, every time I sat in the library and looked at the photographs of my mother and the man who had loved her, I felt a gratitude so deep and so profound that it brought tears to my eyes. Arthur Blackwell had given me a gift beyond measure. He had given me a place to belong. He had given me a connection to my mother's past and a hope for my own future. And he had done it all without ever meeting me, without ever speaking to me, without ever asking for anything in return. That, I realized, was what love really was. Not possession, as Arthur had written in his diary. Not control, not ownership, not the fulfillment of one's own desires. Love was wanting the best for someone else, even if that best meant letting them go. Love was holding on to a house for 50 years because it represented a dream that had never died. Love was leaving that house to the daughter of the woman you had lost, in the hope that she would find happiness there. Love was, in the end, the only thing that mattered.